impressions of this, and then pass it on to these other gentlemen, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. So my name's Terry Wardrop. I'm a teacher out at St. Paul's School. I've been teaching there for 32 years. I've been involved in, I have a degree in computer science. Became known to Red River because I first started studying Alan Turing back in the 70s. Have been fascinated for years. I started teaching artificial intelligence at St. Paul's in the late 90s. Became even more interested, and the school actually gave me some funding. Last year I was able to travel to England, do a lot of research on Turing. I got to have dinner with his last graduate student in Manchester, see a lot of his documents, had a wonderful time, and did a presentation this fall on Turing and his life. And then the movie came out, so we'll continue on with this. But I've always been interested, fascinated in technology and how it can be introduced to a society and change the society. So I've been doing that for years and years. And so what I saw here struck me a number of things. First of all, if you've seen The Imitation Game, you essentially saw the beginnings of what we just witnessed here. It was a group of people working on codes, working on extracting information, and really for the betterment of England, once they knew information, essentially lying to the public for the good of the public, saying, well, we can't tell people what we know because then the Germans will know that we've decoded. And so they actually stepped back and essentially said, for the good of the country, for the war, etc., we have to decide what we disseminate, what we don't. And so there was this a group of government officials who had to make some tough decisions.
How about the same thing with the Japanese,
right?
By the way.
And in the movie, it's supposed to be Alan Turing, but it was actually Winston Churchill and his people. But it made the movie better if it was Alan Turing doing that. I've always been, I'm from Canada. Canada, more socialistic. There's a lot more trust of the government, and that whole ideal of the technology being used, moving us towards an information perfect society where wouldn't it be great if you're walking down the street and you're looking for your friend, you know, if you have your Google glasses on, Google Glass would tell you where your friend is. Oh, they're just around the corner. You know, they're coming your way. You know, just how convenient would that be? You can walk out of stores without showing money or anything. The store knows who you are and what you've picked up, and won't that be great? And so I've been involved with that, you know, the great of what we could do with the new technology, and then essentially here's the downside of it, and we've got to make this decision. For a number of reasons, we haven't had to make these decisions because the technology had not got to a point where it became dangerous, became so you could do anything. Well, now here we are. It reminds me of DNA research, the idea that we can actually choose who's born and who isn't based on our DNA understanding of them. You know, we haven't had to deal with that until now. And all of a sudden we have these really tough questions that we need to ask. Just a last thought, because I'm going to pass to the experts on what you've seen here. But in terms of my artificial intelligence teaching, there's a new computer logic that's coming up. It's called quantum computing. It's just in its infancy. But essentially, traditional computers are built out of gates that are true or false. And essentially, you're seeing kind of the ultimate of where these things are going. A quantum computing gate can be true, false, or true and false. And the people who are working on these quantum computing gates, they're very difficult to do. You have to be at absolute zero to make them work, etc. But essentially, what people are estimating is once they can get a quantum computing system going, all of the encryption that you just saw Snowden depending on will be gone. Essentially, a computer will be able to run so fast that trillions of guesses a second will just be obliterated. So at some point, this is bad, this is serious, but at some point as a society, we actually are going to have to start thinking about what if nothing is private? That there's no way to stop anyone from encrypting anything. So I leave you with that and pass on to, so what I'd like, let's go down and just introduce yourself, your background, and what your thoughts are.
Okay, I'm Rutherford Ford. I am a professor here at the University of New Hampshire Law School. I come from a technology background as well, and then became a lawyer, and so have practiced in areas that relate to a lot of these things for a long time. And one of the areas I focus on now as an academic is privacy law. So I have a couple takeaways I thought were really interesting. One is there's often this sort of myth that if we trust the government's motives, if we trust the government trying to protect security here, then the scandal here is not that these things are happening. The scandal is that they were revealed by someone who didn't go through sort of the proper framework to decide what ought to be public. And I could say, by the way, my normative priors are I think Edward Snowden is one of the most important whistleblowers in the history of the United States. I think the things that he revealed are one of the greatest scandals in the history of the country. But I see the argument on the other side, which is that this is putting security at risk. And so I think one important thing to realize when you're thinking about that is that the NSA intercepts info in a lot of different ways, and the movie hints at this a little bit. So one thing they do is working with companies under court orders to turn things over. But another thing they do is use a lot of security flaws, and they have an enormous number of computer scientists and mathematicians working at the NSA trying to find flaws in security software, trying to find ways to get at some of the things they're collecting that were not intended by the companies that are transmitting them.
You can buy them on the commercial market.
I was about to say that. There is at this point a thriving black market where if you are a security software researcher, you can go find, and if you come up with a flaw, you can sell it on the black market for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the NSA buys these. So one of the things that Edward Snowden revealed in the documents that he made available was that the NSA spends about $250 million a year trying to discover and create security flaws. And that's not merely a matter of the federal government, being able to collect that info. That's also a matter of if the federal government can use those flaws, so can anyone else who can find them. And so you have to think not only about what a good actor federal government is going to do with all of this data, but also what any other country might do, or the Sony hackers, North Korea, anybody else who might be able to get that kind of system working. I guess the other point I wanted to make is that this is kind of a recurring pattern in the national security state, where every few decades there come to be things that a lot of people think of as abuses, maybe not everyone does, and they are revealed often by a whistleblower, and then there is a cycle of reforms. This happened famously in the 70s. And I think what might make this time a little bit different is the degree to which the political process really was not prepared to respond to this in any sort of pro-reform way. So Congress has repeatedly basically ratified things that the NSA had been doing once they find out about them. They granted immunity to telecom providers after the telecom providers were sued. We saw one of the oral arguments there. And so we're just at a point where it's very hard for Congress to do anything, where it's very hard for the political process to really perform its role here. That's compounded in part by, so we saw President Obama talking about how it might be better if people had let this debate take place in the ordinary course. And there's a lot of really important work recently that finds that when you have groups that are ideologically coherent, cohesive, debating things, they tend to become more extreme if they're not diverse. And so if that debate is really taking place within the NSA, within the intelligence community, within the military, that's not a diverse group. And so you see things like someone who was a very pro-reform or pro-civil liberties candidate, Obama, within an environment where everyone is on one side having that debate, and it's not really a debate because everyone's on one side, and so that group becomes even more extreme. A lot of people are very worried about a 29-year-old deciding I'm going to unilaterally make all these things available, and I don't like that. I don't like that he had to be the one to decide to do that, but that may be sort of the least bad response to this, where the alternative is to let the NSA and the military and the intelligence community really internally decide what makes sense. So that's a couple thoughts.
Well, thank you. My name is John Graby, and I too teach at UNH School of Law. So I'm privileged to be one of Roger's colleagues, and I've also been a colleague of Terry before because I've taught at the Advanced Studies program in the summer over at St. Paul's School. So I'm very pleased to be joining our fourth panelist tonight and have a chance to meet you as well. I am not an expert in technology or privacy, certainly in the way that Roger is. I teach constitutional law, among other topics, at the law school. And so I suspect that I'm invited here to maybe cast some light on some of the constitutional questions that are inevitably going to arise in connection with any discussion of this incredibly provocative film that we all just saw. Before I get into the constitutional issues, just a quick aside, that Edward Snowden, I would agree with Roger's assessment about his importance. And he becomes yet another character in a long line that goes back, at least to Antigone, right, in ancient times, which raise these figures that raise the question: when is it appropriate to opt out of the governmental system based on your own convictions, based on your own sense of what is right and what is wrong, what is lawful, what is not lawful, and how do we develop metrics for assessing when people are on the correct side of that line, when you have a Martin Luther King on one hand versus a Timothy McVeigh, perhaps, on the other, to pick a couple of extremes. And it's one of the great classic inquiries. And again, so it's just, so at that level alone, Edward Snowden is just, and this whole event is just an incredibly interesting and profound development. Keeps us asking the most foundational questions about justice and government and right and wrong and our obligation as citizens. So, shifting to the constitutional side, I thought I would do two things. First, just to cast a little bit more light on what was going on in that snippet of oral argument before the Ninth Circuit that you saw. The lawyers that were locking horns before the court were not actually addressing the merits of whether there should be liability under some positive law for what the defendant in that case was accused of doing. They were talking about whether our judicial system should even be involved in policing the lines and in policing the boundaries. The lawyer for the plaintiff was arguing that absolutely, this goes back to Marbury versus Madison, the judiciary needs to get involved and needs to draw constitutional lines and exercise that power of judicial review so that we have meaningful First and Fourth Amendment protections as we sort through all of this stuff. On the other side, the government lawyer was saying, no, this is not justiciable, this shouldn't be in a court. This should be left to the political process. And we do have a tradition of the court system, even in the face of, ripe constitutional claims being raised by parties who would seem to have standing, saying, this is something that needs to be worked out in the political branches. We can't really devise standards for determining where the constitutional lines are, or we don't have the expertise. This is known as the political question doctrine, and then related justiciability doctrines that were at issue in that case. So that's what was going on in that case. And what's really interesting is that ordinarily, of course, the argument in favor of the judiciary staying out is this is going to get worked out in the in the political branches. If we don't like what's happening, there's always an election around the corner. Well, that's all well and good when we know the basic facts. But when we don't know the basic facts, there's something, to me, that's deeply troubling about the government taking the position that we ought to be deferring to the political process when there's no sunshine, there's no sunlight. So that was one thing that I wanted to point out. The second thing I wanted to do was to actually read you the first couple of paragraphs from an article that was written by Richard Posner. Richard Posner is, and remains, he was at the time that he wrote this and remains an incredibly gifted and important federal judge who serves on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals in Chicago. He's also a professor at the University of Chicago. I don't know, Roger, if you've had occasion to.
Yeah, I worked for him for several months.
Oh, well, okay, so he certainly knows Richard Posner. Okay, and this was an essay that Richard Posner wrote. It was published on December 1st, 2001, so 3 months after the 9/11 attacks. And it's called Security versus Civil Liberties. And the reason I read it, this is something I always use in my constitutional law class because it raises one of the most profound divides about constitutional law. So let me just read a couple paragraphs to give you the flavor of this. Posner writes, in the wake of the September 11th terrorist attacks have come many proposals for tightening security. Some measures to that end have already been taken. Civil libertarians are troubled. They fear that concerns about national security will lead to an erosion of civil liberties. They offer historical examples of supposed overreactions to threats to national security. They treat our existing civil liberties, freedom of the press, protections of privacy, and of the rights of criminal suspects and the rest, as sacrosanct, insisting that the battle against international terrorism accommodate itself to them. I consider this a profoundly mistaken approach to the question of balancing liberty and security. The basic mistake is the prioritizing of liberty. It is a mistake about law and a mistake about history. Let me begin with law. What we take to be our civil liberties, for example, immunity from arrest except upon probable cause to believe we've committed a crime, and from prosecution for violating a criminal statute enacted after we committed the act that violates it, were made legal rights by the Constitution and other enactments. The other enactments can be changed relatively easily by amending mandatory legislation. Amending the Constitution is much more difficult. In recognition of this, the framers left most of the constitutional provisions that confer rights pretty vague. The courts have made them definite. Last paragraph I'll read. Concretely, the scope of these rights has been determined through an interaction of constitutional text and subsequent judicial interpretation by a weighing of competing interests. I'll call them the public safety interest and the liberty interest. Neither, in my view, has priority. They are both important, and their relative importance changes from time to time and from situation to situation. And I'll leave it right there because this, to me, always provides a provocative point of entry into a discussion with my constitutional law class about the meaning of the Constitution. Is the meaning of the Constitution fixed? Is it time-dated? Is it objectively ascertainable? Or is it to be infused with meaning over time by those within our system who operationalize constitutional meaning? Okay. Largely the judges, but also all public officials who swear an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution at the federal level and at the state level. There is no answer to that question. That's one of the questions of constitutional law that has always been debated and always will be debated. I tend to come down myself on the side of the living, flexible Constitution. And yet, when that happens, we see what can happen in the context of a frightened populace. And I just would point out that just, with last week's horrible events in France, what is France doing right now? France is enacting a series of measures curtailing civil rights and civil liberties. So this is an age-old balancing act that is playing out. But it just seems to me that the stakes have never been higher.
Chris?
So I'm Chris Breton. I've worked security for about 20 years now. I've done consulting and training for a number of different government agencies, a little bit for the military, written a number of, I think about 10 different books on computer security. Don't work at a local university, but I'm a fellow instructor for the SANS Institute who's been teaching security since about the mid-90s, back when nobody else was doing it. So yeah, my perspective's kind of unique because when I got started, what the government was doing for security had a very, I don't want to say, defensive feel to it, and that kind of changed over time, which is a lot of what got me out of it. One correction I do want to make on the movie is that we kind of keep talking about 9/11 terrorism drove this, 9/11 terrorism drove this. If you do a little research, you'll find that some of these facilities that were talked about actually kind of date back to 2000. So terrorism is more the excuse after the fact, maybe in some cases, versus the actual catalyst that started it in the first place. A lot of this is, kind of focused on the government side, but quite honestly, there's kind of a balance between who's worse, the commercial industry or the government at any given time, and they both tend to kind of feed each other. For anybody who works in software, there's this whole thing called a secondary revenue stream. Just out of curiosity, how many people use Uber? Anybody? We got one person, and Bill should know better, he works for me. So, don't actually install it on your phone, but especially if you have Android, Android's really good at it. When you go to download it, look at the permissions it wants on your system. So Uber is basically a kind of a car sharing service, and you can do an awful lot of reading about some of the things they've been up to. But one of the things they've been up to is they basically scrape your address book, they grab your GPS locations, so Snowden talked about, if I can start creating links, I can start learning a lot about you. Uber's become one of these central locations to be able to kind of collect that information. Now, why are they collecting it? Well, they will say it's part of making their product better. Really what it's about is the secondary revenue stream I'm talking about. But now if you have a government trying to connect disconnected dots, well, what better than a company like Uber that has all those dots connected? They make more money off it, it kind of feeds, it kind of runs from there. And this is something that's been going on for a while. The other thing that I kind of want to clear, that at least from my perspective, everybody kind of keeps talking about this being a technical issue. I had someone I was talking to today saying, oh yeah, I want to see the movie, but I'm not really technical, so I don't know if I'll follow it. And I don't really see this as a technical issue. I see it maybe as more of a moral or a liberty issue. This is just, a catalyst is part of it. I mean, you can go back a number of years, and the problem was, people were using binoculars and telescopes to peer into bedrooms. There's the issue right there. This becomes a little bit more problematic, and I've run into this with a number of companies where they would have a physical break-in in the facility and get completely freaked out. Oh my God, we gotta bar the windows, we gotta do all this stuff. But when you look at what did that company lose, well, maybe a couple of laptops walked out the door. That's it. So when you look at it strictly from a financial aspect to the business, they're probably out maybe $2,000 and that's insured. Now you look at a data compromise where maybe some IP has been stolen, and that has a huge implication to it. And I'll see companies look at that, and even though the dollar value is literally magnitudes higher than that couple of laptops going out the door, because it's virtual, we tend to kind of brush it under the rug. And I think that's a lot of what's going on here is, you think about, yeah, okay, they can track my phone, and they can figure out this, and they know what I buy off of Amazon, and Google keeps my history indefinitely, everything I've ever searched on ever. But it doesn't really interrupt my day. It's not a physical thing, so it's kind of hard for me to relate to. It's kind of funny because my wife works at home. She's got a room that has like a little archway that leads off. We've got her a gas stove, and the whole idea of the gas stove was to warm the room. Well, with this big opening going into another room, all the heat leaks So I built her a nice set of sliding doors to close it up. And had somebody kind of say to me, well, you know, you're kind of a software guy, why are you doing that? And I'm like, oh, I love that, because I can take anyone in this room, point to what I did, you understand it, it makes sense, because it's a physical thing and it's physical beings, that's what we're used to referring to. If I try to describe what we do on a daily basis, I'm only gonna lose half the people in the room, and the other half may get lost after about 10 minutes. It's a little bit less tangible. And that's why a lot of this stuff has become so pervasive, is because it doesn't really materialize in the physical world. You know, we don't really, I think, get as bothered by it as we should. The other thing that was kind of brought up in the movie that kind of caught my attention was they were talking about the espionage laws that date back to World War I. I think it's important to note that if you look at how many presidents have enacted that to go after somebody, there's been more in this White House administration than every other one combined, from what I understand. So as far as, you know, how often is this happening, you know, it's increasing. And, you know, one of the things that I can say from folks that I'm friends with that are still in that field, the Obama speech they had where he said, you know, this should have been handled internally. It isn't getting handled internally.
Yeah.
For you to raise this issue immediately puts you on this list. It makes your life miserable. So there's no mechanism built in. It's also the watch list they talk about. It's real easy to get on. There's no real documented way to get off of that again. There's no approval process for pulling people off. So that's my fun part of all this.
What we say? There were 1.2 million people on that
Yeah,
list.
my guess is that number's a low ballpark.
Yeah.
I think that's primary targets versus all the secondaries that they pull in as part of that.
However, it's a big number, and if you read the people who are reviewing this movie and essentially fact-checking,
Right.
that 1.2 is a big discussion point. And the question is, if it's high, if it's low, it's still
Still
up.
too much.
Yeah, it's still a pretty big number. Yeah, I think the idea is here, we would love to entertain questions from people.
Just one last thing I wanted to bring up as part of that, when you kind of contemplate what does that information they're collecting mean? It was not specifically stated in the movie, but if you watch the timeline they were identifying underneath, they knew who he was within 2 days. Now, when you think about how many people work for the government, how many people he was talking about had access to that information, for them to single him out that quickly, how many data points had to get pulled together for that?
It struck me just hearing that, and the concept of the metadata that's being developed. It reminded me of the story of the research into what you actually can learn about a person based on metadata. There's a whole lot of people out there just learning.
And my worry with that is the circle's kind of broken. So for example, I may look at certain data points and find out that, okay, so people who smoke cigarettes show up at a convenience store every day before they go to work.
Yep.
So, and here's a data point where I can say, you know, I've got 10 smokers over here, they all do this. Therefore, anybody who goes to a convenience store before work must be a smoker. Well, that's not a correct assumption, but that's part of what actually gets programmed into this. Now, as this stuff starts getting feeded back into the commercial side, you could very well find yourself in a position where you're going for insurance, but you're classified as a smoker because of a miss in the data, and now you're paying a higher rate and don't even know why.
We're working through this in our AI course, and the great story that the kids are finding is the target metadata analysis program that started sending information to a family about, well, based on what we've learned, there's someone there who must be pregnant.
Oh,
And-
target story.
And the father
Yep.
got all upset, and then essentially they found out that the daughter was pregnant and hadn't told the father.
And
So
Target knew before the dad did.
exactly. So that kind of capability of where we're just the industry is just learning what it can learn. It's sort of they're discovering the power, and sometimes it's grandiose, and sometimes it actually is.
A good practice, or a good kind of test of this, as bad as Google is at collecting everything on you, if you dig in enough, they will actually show you what they've collected. Disconnect yourself from the fact that it's your data and you kind of understand what the reason you were searching for, whatever. But start lining those up and kind of see, so if I didn't know it was me and I didn't know the reason why, what assumptions might I make? And you'd be scared about some of the interpretations that could possibly come out of it.
So, you had,
But, it's interesting, Terry. I think it's in it, because you've got the Googles, you got the Amazon, who hasn't bought stuff on Amazon, then you go out there later, and it's, you might be interested in this, and so they're constantly building that profile, but the impetus for doing that is increasing your revenue stream. So kind of, if you turn that around, look from the government standpoint, what's the impetus there? I think that's a little bit more, that's a lot vaguer, goes to potentially darker areas.
Yeah, and the reality is the government probably doesn't care about most people. And so, one big difference between the current scenario and like 1984, Big Brother was, controlling the lives to some degree of everyone. And now it's very much, they collect all of this info so that 1.2 million interesting people they can do something with. The problem is that the process, well, there are several problems with that, but one problem is that it's so massively over-inclusive that it brings in all sorts of other things, and therefore it gives you lots of false positives. And so, there's not 1.2 million terrorists in the world. There's not 120,000 terrorists in the world. So there are a lot of very innocent people who get wrapped up in that. And so, the government is doing the equivalent of Amazon there. They're trying to maximize their use of the data for their purposes, and they're just externalizing all of these costs onto everyone.
yes.
How much at risk is our national security in terms of our power infrastructure, Hoover Dam, major blackouts, things of that nature?
You don't want to ask that question. You don't want to ask that question.
Yeah, that's the
So
thing
when
I
you-
worry
so-
about
so-
too.
So think about your home desktop system that you use. Probably once a month, maybe you notice, maybe you don't, you get patches that say, hey, and a patch is basically when the programmer wrote it, they missed something, they screwed up, there's some sort of security vulnerability, here's new software to fix that. Most of the SCADA network that's designed to run that is burned into hardware, which means it's not easily upgraded. Which means that if I find a window exploit today, and I go tell Microsoft about it, next month you'll be safe from that attack. For the same thing on the SCADA side, once it's found, it's probably out there until they replace that hardware.
And so the answer is yes, there are big vulnerabilities. There have only been a few times where it's happened. The US government wrote a computer virus that caused, I'm trying to remember the details here, I think it was nuclear centrifuges in Iran to spin.
It was never proved it was the US government.
Yes, okay. It is widely believed that the US government wrote a virus that caused them to spin out of control until they destroyed themselves. There was recently another case where something happened in the real world based on an electronic vulnerability, but I don't remember what it was. Do you know?
It's been a couple.
Yeah.
So that sort of thing can definitely happen, yeah.
Yeah,
And
I know there was someone did a thing where they kind of showed they could get a generator to think it was in a cooler state than it was and actually blow up and catch on fire.
The North Korea thing, right? Just a couple weeks ago, right? Didn't the North Korea internet system go down?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right after the hack into.
We cut
Well,
off
yeah,
something
but,
right
but,
off.
but
Right,
to,
right.
but to be fair,
Yeah.
any one of the four of us could have done that to North Korea.
Down to three.
Give us 3 minutes at the
3 minutes,
terminal, I
okay.
can show you how to do it. So, saying you knocked down North Korea's network is nothing to brag about.
Okay, all right.
But it's interesting because the reason you can do a lot of those things is these software vulnerabilities. And so there is a benefit to trying to fix them. and instead we're trying to create more.
So,
We
so
have
to
a
go back,
question over there, just sorry.
Yeah, it seems that the intelligence agencies are essentially functioning now as a phantom fourth branch of government without oversight in opaque fashion. I'm just wondering, is there any sort of avenue within our current framework that could be pursued to actually rein them in, or potentially even have that be an option? So I guess probably Professor Gravy would be absolutely on the spot, but I mean, is it just, watching that little snippet of the Ninth Circuit, it just seemed like the judiciary was kind of left impotent. Is there anything that can be, potentially be done?
You know, I mean, even if the judiciary, even when the judiciary is not impotent, it issues declaratory rulings, that, that are based on a very particular set of facts, where somebody who was motivated enough to bring a case is able to get a judgment. And then, of course, we depend on respect for that ruling, from the coordinate branches of government. It's hard to be reassuring.
things like this make it that much harder, because,
Yeah.
they found themselves in that position of, well, we don't wanna hear you unless you can prove that you were actually compromised specifically,
Right.
but that data that says whether you were or not is classified, so you don't get access to that. But we won't open it up unless you can prove you did it, but you can't get the data to prove it.
Yeah, and that case was argued before the Snowden leaks came out, and the Supreme Court said, you don't have evidence that you were actually targeted, and or that any of your info was really collected, and therefore you don't have standing. And I think the Snowden documents probably give everyone standing.
Yeah, because if it's, the dragnet spying is a violation of everyone's Fourth Amendment rights, so couldn't any one individual theoretically bring an
Well,
evidence?
there's actually 3 cases right now that are making their way through the court system. And I think they're at the, if I remember correctly, the Second Circuit has a case under advisement, that's in New York. The DC Circuit has a case under advisement, and then the Ninth Circuit has a bunch of cases that are making their way up. And I think it is likely that the Supreme Court will weigh in. There's a Clapper case from a couple of years ago, went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said no standing. I do think there's going to be standing now, and I think even Scalia and Ginsburg were out on a road show last year and said, admitted that they're likely to have to weigh in on this. But, what is the effect of that? Okay, so we get a pronouncement from the Supreme Court. Well, how will that translate into responsiveness in the political branches? It depends. I wish I could be
There is
reassuring.
a useful analog here, which is the Guantanamo cases, where the Supreme Court last decade ruled against the government 4 times in 7 years, and that had an effect. It gave detainees an opportunity to go to court and to try to prove, or to get the government to prove that they were lawfully held. And so you did see then the government releasing a lot of people when they didn't really have good enough evidence. And so you could see something like that happen. We'll see.
Question back there?
I'm just struck that, and I've heard it said that, they do this because they can. And there's this notion that we ought to be outraged that our privacy is being interfered with, et cetera. There's no question that the government can do this. There's no question in my mind that lots of other governments can do this. There's no question in my mind that Google and Amazon and Facebook do this all the time. And I'm not sure that I trust those guys any more than I trust the government. So, I mean, to what extent do we just need to say, the cat's out of the bag, and we need to accept the fact that it's not private anymore. And Verizon keeps the data, everybody keeps the data. And I don't know what Verizon does with my data, other than give it to the government. So.
They do, well, again, that secondary reseller network I talked about, they
Yeah.
do sell it.
Exactly.
So Verizon has a thing where any website you go to, they have a unique feature that they can track you and they can identify what sites you've gone to. So typically, if I'm a vendor and he's a vendor, you know, I'm Amazon and he's, you know, whatever, you come to me, I can tell it's you coming back to me again, but I can't necessarily tell you've gone over there. And if you have, I can't tell what you've done. Verizon, because they own the back end, is able to tie that stuff together. And it makes a decent amount of money off of doing it, which is why you can try and opt out of it, and you can almost opt out of it, but not quite.
Also push, I'm looking at let me say it this way, the average age of all of us in here, in this room, as opposed to the younger students that I teach. Younger students tend to really not be as concerned with the privacy of what they do. They've lived their whole life online, and so if this allows them to meet their friend around the corner because the system tells them where they are, that's a great thing. And they're not as
I
concerned.
want to press back on that a little, though. There was a really interesting blog post I read a few days ago by a 19-year-old student at the University of Texas describing the different social media networks that his peers use and the things they use them for. And it was this extraordinarily nuanced, contextual, network by network set of very different uses. So Facebook was used mostly for suitable for public consumption posts intended for family members.
Exactly, older people.
Nobody understood what Twitter was for.
Bingo.
The thing that people use Instagram for very specific things, Snapchat for very specific things, WhatsApp for very specific things. There was like 15 different networks that were used on this extraordinarily privacy-minded, context-dependent set of reasons. And so, one of the things he said in this post was that Tumblr was interesting because it's basically anonymous, and if anyone ever links it to you and discovers it, you can just immediately get a new name on it and move all your stuff over to that, and then they can't follow you there very easily. And so, I think people are finding ways to be cognizant of privacy, just, maybe as against their peer group as opposed to as against Google. And that might have to do with, what the downsides are, how easy it is to think about ways that your privacy will be violated. Maybe that it's less visceral that Google can do stuff to you.
Well, and again, as you're saying, it's that kind of catch-22 between it's useful, but what's the cost to me?
Yeah.
So Google has a thing called cards that, kind of identifies this is what's going on. And my wife and I have a running joke because every now and then Google will come up and not tell me this is how long it takes me to go home, but this is how long it takes to get to Shaw's and Merrimack where I go shopping.
Yeah.
So they've actually figured out I go by there. So my wife and I have a
That's your
running
home?
comment, gonna be late tonight, Google says I gotta go to Shaw's.
Because eventually your internet refrigerator will actually be telling Shaw's what you need.
Exactly.
There's a question back there.
I was just listening to the podcast today, and they were mentioning about quantum computing, and they made a comment that within 20 years, the power of the computing will be equivalent to the mind of everyone that's on the planet. So if that's true, that's immediate information. I mean, we'd be slow now, right? As far as the government trying to get information from us. In that time, it's gonna be like that, and the people won't even have an option to think.
So that will come online.
Yeah, come on.
Well, it's kind of that,
But is that true? I don't know.
Well, Moore's law, yes. These
Or,
things keep increasing.
let's call it Moore's observation, which
Yeah, that's true.
continues to be true.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is true, I stand correct. But at the same time, we tend to be pretty creative as a species, so the comment was made that, quantum is gonna make, encryption useless. And for the way we use encryption today, yeah. But that doesn't mean it won't help us come out with another way that makes it a little bit harder, that, when you look at, and encryption is always a moving target. When you look at, desencryption was our standard for like 30 years. And desencryption, at the time we were using it, was like, my God, you'll never crack it. And now it's, with about, 12 $12,000, $15,000 worth of gear, Bill, I can go in less than that.
One high-end video card in 3 days.
Yeah, I can build a system that'll crack one of those dead and protected messages in less than a day, easily. So we've come out with new standards that are harder, but again, give it another 10 years and that makes it easy to crack. And that's one of the things that's kind of interesting, that we're talking about kind of collecting all the content, there's a reason for that. And that is, if I'm using something they can't crack today, 3 years from now, they might be able to, it might be a whole lot easier. That's one of the things that I always kind of impress on my students when they talk about what level of encryption do they need in the network. Don't look at what is crackable today. Think about how long that data will have value. Will that credit card still be be valid 10 years from now? Probably not. Your social security number? Absolutely. Okay, I need to be thinking 10 years out, not right now.
Got a question here?
Well, it's a comment. I think it's important that people be aware of or think about. Probably more than half the people here are on Facebook and they post things on Facebook. I'm sure numbers of people here, when they go to Hannaford or Shaw's, they use their little, discount cards so that Shaw's knows what they bought. When you go to Rite Aid, you have a wellness card that tracks all your,
There's a reason they'll give you a
prescriptions
discount,
that you
because
bought.
they can make more
And
money
we
off of that data
freely give up
someplace else.
information to corporations so that we get a 2% discount or $3 off on something that we buy. But when the government wants information, all of a sudden we're concerned about privacy and people knowing things about us. I don't think the issue is government. I think the issue is the private corporations. And even Snowden, he didn't work for the government. He worked for a private company. His level of security was, and they said, he had security levels above any of the NSA workers. It isn't the government workers that are tracking you. The government gets the information from these private corporations, and they're the ones that have the information. The government is purchasing it, or maybe going with subpoenas to get it, but we've willingly given up. If you have a smartphone, like you were saying, the smartphone is tracking all your activities, you're leaving that stuff up, you're allowing them to get that information on you. We willingly give that information. And I think it's important for people to be conscious about that and think about what they're doing. And if you're that concerned about government, maybe you should start thinking about the corporations that are tracking
Well,
you.
but
Because
that's
that's
why I
where the
said
information's coming from. It's not coming from the government.
That's not necessarily true. So one of the things that came out in the movie
It's
was,
primarily coming from private corporations.
so one of the things that was kind of brought up in the movie was that we were able to create some of these listening posts under the pretense of, we'll share information with you if you share with us. It's not unrealistic to think there isn't similar deals with, let's say, people in the corporate world. So, for example, you share some information with us, you get something back that has value to you. No reason to think that's just limited to other governments. So to say it's not a government, whether it be ours or someone else, I think it's 50-50.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's not totally the government, but, like this movie or on things you eat, everybody's all upset about the government tracking us. But you don't hear people talking about being tracked by Target or, Home Depot.
I think it's a constantly moving target. Google just got slapped pretty hard in Europe with some of their practices. So I think it just, one comes up, another one goes in the background for a little while, and we just cycle.
But it's also a particularly American view to be worried mostly about the government. There was an op-ed in, I think it was in The Guardian, a few months ago about someone from France, I believe, talking about how they're not worried about the government, they're worried about Google. This is something privacy people talk about. There's a European view that it's really the companies that are the problem.
I'm in Canadian.
But it's interesting, in terms of people, being willing to give up their info for a 2% discount, the thing I think a lot of people don't realize is that it's a lot bigger than that. So Target doesn't have a discount card. Target has one of the biggest databases out there of info about who their customers are and what they buy, and they haven't assembled it based on a card that you voluntarily provide. They've assembled it based on credit card info.
They
So-
have one of the biggest commercial Hadoop deployments out of
Yeah.
any company.
Like we were talking about the thing where they recognize someone as pregnant. What happened there was they recognize that there are a few times in people's lives where their habits are open to being recalibrated. Because normally if you go to one store, you keep going to that one store. And so figuring out the times when your life is in upheaval and you're willing to make new habits is really valuable for retailers. And one of the big ones is when you're pregnant. And so they started mining their data set for, okay, when people start buying diapers, what do they start buying 8 months earlier? And so they found like hand cream was a big one. People, when they become pregnant, start buying hand cream for some reason. And they came up with this algorithm that decided, here's how we can tell someone is in their first trimester and so forth. And when they started sending out coupons for pregnancy stuff, there was this massive uproar, and the 16-year-old's father who said, my daughter's not pregnant, what are you talking about? And so rather than stop doing it, what they did was they started preparing coupon books where there would be coupons for the things they thought people who were pregnant wanted, but interspersed among other coupons that were decoys. And so now it doesn't look like Target is targeting you, no pun intended. But they're doing it anyway. Just one last data point on that. There are 1,200 companies in this country that do online targeted advertising, that have ad networks that put cookies on your computer. You've heard of maybe 0 of them. I've heard of like 5. But there's another 1,200 out there. And, how do you protect yourself from that? Not go to-
I just heard about this. They are, when you see advertising with faces, what they're doing is they're finding your friends,
Oh, yep.
they're getting photographs of your friends, and they're making an amalgam face that will be in the ads that you see.
Will be familiar to you.
They will, so these faces will be familiar to you because they're made up of all your friends. So, yeah.
I just wanna,
Yeah.
I wanna support the point you made, just with an observation. When we give our privacy up to corporations, the quid pro quo is right there, it's obvious. You get the discount or you get the convenience.
Sometimes.
Sometimes,
Yeah.
well, sometimes. What we get from the government in giving that privacy up is less obvious. It's an absence of catastrophic attack, right? I mean, if this is really, to the extent that this is driven by security, it's not something you're feeling every day, but when something happens, again, I go back to the news reports following France. I mean, what were French officials immediately saying? It was outrageous. How could we have not seen this coming? And you think about that, it's like, well, seen it coming. This was a free person who had a past, but
Who went
unless
to
they
jail
were
for this problem.
right, but was out and free. Like, how would you see it coming? Unless you are conducting just amazing levels of surveillance of everybody who's walking around on the street, and yet this was clearly being treated by government as a lapse in failing to anticipate this attack.
Do we
It's
want
a scary world, though.
Harrison Ford and Tom Clancy's people there protecting us? Those people who are totally obsessed with our safety, and that's what they're there for, good people. Do we want to give them the tools to do what they're doing?
It's not, I'm not trying to defend that, but I think that's another reason maybe why government is more of a target in our minds, why we object to it more than we do in the corporate setting, because we don't feel that quid pro quo in the same tangible way.
I think the media promotes that and, the right wing and all that sort of thing.
I think to some
But I
extent it
think-
does come back to, do we really mean it when we say live free or die? And those are the only 2 options.
I think, it's an interesting kind of thought you got from there, because essentially by doing this data mining and essentially doing the surveillance, what you're really trying to do is anticipate the act and hopefully run it off. But now you got the problem, what happens if you guess wrong? What if your inference engine makes the incorrect inference? Now you suddenly, you've got somebody pounding down somebody's door, grandma's standing there in her stocking feet because she happened to Google, something about, Hajibs or something like that.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
this goes
that's
back,
the problem you run
and
into.
I brought that up earlier because that one's kind of an extreme. you know, and that if they break down your door because they think you're a terrorist, they'll figure out fairly quickly you're not, and then that can be kind of level set. But there's the,
And you'll still be on the do not fly list.
yes, but it's all the subtleties that bother me, like I don't really understand why my car insurance is more than everybody else. I don't really understand why my health insurance is more than everybody else. Well, maybe somebody made that wrong algorithm choice.
Yeah.
And now you're suffering from that and you don't even realize it or see why.
We have time for one more question or comment. Yes?
There's such an inevitability about all this, and I think that's why young people react to it the way they do, and that's the way I do. I go, well, this is the way it is. It's gonna, and inevitably, it's gonna, more as observation or whatever, it's gonna get more. Well, our hope is that it gets so good at it that there's less false positives, and that the government is benevolent, that's in control of all this. And you're into artificial intelligence. The question really, ultimately, the AI is gonna take it over. The question is there anything such as artificial morality or ethics? Asimov's laws of robotics. Is there any way that we can write a new constitution for this that will make sure that at least in the bulk of the civilized world, it is being overseen benevolently?
Skynet.
Thank you for invoking the Terminator. Yes.
Electronic moral consciousness to make a
Well, that was a
decision
cautionary
about-
tale. It was not history. Yeah, or maybe it was. Who do we? Time travel. We don't know.
Yeah. I think we've run out of time, so. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I